Okay, so again, I'm Nolan Hames, and let me introduce Julie Turberg. Just take it away and let's jump in.
All right, let's talk about white space today. White space is really important in design. We're going to talk about why white space is important and how it can help you in your presentations. So what is white space? You may have heard of it before, and it refers to the areas in your design that do not contain any content. So it's the canvas space in between your graphics, your columns, your images, your text, your margins, and other elements. White space doesn't have to be white. It's also called negative space or blank space. Here's a typical slide, one with way too many words. But this is the white space. And here's another one. Here's a column chart. And all of this is white space also. So why is it important? Let's take a look at some examples from my inspiration notebook and break it down a little bit further. White space separates and groups elements, and it keeps the design from being too cluttered or too confusing. Now, without it, the viewer doesn't know where to look. Here, the elements are separated with space to breathe in between. Now, separating with white space also helps to establish some hierarchy and order. It's a way to organize your text and the content to guide your viewer's attention to certain elements on the slide or on the page. Now, these designs here use white space effectively to create some really interesting compositions. And also from my inspiration notebook, these examples here, white space is used to add emphasis and focus in your designs. It makes things stand out. Our brains tend to put emphasis and importance on those design elements that are surrounded by white space. That space is giving you visual clues about where you should be looking and directing your eye. So one of the things we see often is that important design elements like logos are surrounded by white space. This makes sure they're emphasized and clearly visible. Another important reason to use white space is that it enhances readability. Good line spacing matters a lot. If your lines of text are too close together or too far apart, they can be difficult to read. White space, while this is not necessarily important, I find it important to point out that white space implies luxury and elegance or sophistication. I read a great analogy recently about comparing white space and dining out at a five-star restaurant versus a cheap diner. So at the gourmet restaurant, your food is plated neatly and there's plenty of white space arranged on the plate. While at the diner, everything's piled up, all the food's piled on the plate with little room for anything else. The same goes for your designs. Too many graphic elements are going to cheapen the overall look. Now remember, simpler designs are beautiful, and we don't need to fill our slides to deliver a clear and direct message. White space can actually become a central element in a design when used to create a certain mood or look. I thought it was kind of interesting that this ad on the lower right is for Oreo cookies, and it looks just as elegant and sophisticated as the other three for high-end brands.
Oreo's elegant in my mind.
Especially the thin ones,
Yes.
aren't they? So let's talk about how to design with white space. How do we take all these principles we just heard about and apply them to our slides? First, you want to separate and group elements. It may be obvious, but all of us have seen slides where folks just throw everything but the kitchen sink onto a slide without any thought to separating and leaving some natural space in between. This also helps to establish that hierarchy of elements. It guides your viewer's attention throughout the content. You want to limit the elements and keep things simple. There's no need to fill this slide, the entire width of this slide, with this simple column chart. Let the white space work for you to keep things organized and in order.
Hey, Julie.
Yeah.
I agree with you. There's no need, but very often on a slide like this, you're going to get client pushback and say, well, we have the space. Let's make it as big as possible so people in the back of the room can see it. How do you respond to a client who just wants to fill the space with content, even by putting more content in or just the text bigger?
Yeah, typically I show them a before and after. I will show them what their intention is and their request, and compare and contrast with the version that I suggest. And more times than not, they'll go with the one that I suggested because they see that not only is it very visible and focused, but it's more appealing, more attractive. It's again, it gives you a little bit of breathing room on the slide. It's not so in your face, filled up with too much stuff. So here's another example. This slide is split into almost 3 equal sections, but there's lots of white space to guide your eye through the title, the content, the picture, etc. Here's a sample of an asymmetrical composition. This was actually inspired by that design you saw early on early on when we were talking about the importance of white space. Now you can see that there's plenty of white space for visual breathing room, but there's also plenty of room to see the imagery, to read the title clearly, and to read any notes that we might want to contain within there. How about emphasizing one element, but balancing it out with a bunch of white space? Let the white space do its job so that you can simply focus on making the important elements look their best. Let's talk a minute about margins, because this is a really common problem in presentations. A lot of folks, they'll put the titles really close to the top of the slide, and in terms of shapes with text inside of them, this one has no padding around it at all. And by padding, I mean the margin inside of a shape where the text is resting. It makes it really difficult to read text. There's a lot of visual tension when you put things like text too close to the edges of your slide. You also run the risk, if your text is too close to the edge, or logos too close to the edge, for instance, you run the risk of having those things cut off if you're projecting on a projector that hasn't been aligned properly to the screen. So you want to bring things in a little bit more. We'll see that in a second. This is also a dead giveaway when I see a presentation or a slide or a template that has titles too close to the edge and text too close to the edges. It's a dead giveaway that your company likes to put too much on their slides.
I would say the same with Arial Narrow, right?
Oh, true. Yeah, you can fit more words on a line, right?
It just looks more crowded, even if it's not.
Yeah, it does. It has that feeling. So here's the same exact slide with margins. It's got margins around the entire perimeter of the slide. Each one of the shapes that has text in it has more margin. Everything has more breathing room. It's much more comfortable to look at than the previous slide. Let's talk about line spacing. So that quote right there really looks like a dense clump of letters. It's not doing anybody any favors. So let's talk about good line spacing and how it can work for you. You get a little bit of breath of fresh air. Now we can read the words. They're separated nicely. What about all that white space, negative space, up at the top and on the right-hand side? What that's doing for us, it's creating an asymmetrical composition, but it's leading to more interesting and dynamic composition, other than just slapping that quote smack dab in the center of the slide. Try using white space off to the top and the sides. You don't need to have everything centered. Now pay attention to paragraph spacing also if you're going to have a couple of lines of text. This one should be 3 separate statements. However, with only 6-point spacing, it looks really cluttered and crowded. It starts to look like a continuous wall of text. So we want to give it a little bit of breathing room. Add a little bit more space in between paragraphs. Give the viewer's eye a chance to rest in between statements, and it doesn't look so cluttered and confusing. Now here's a great example from our very own Nolan Hames. Here's a great example of white space being used to focus your eye on that beautiful orange carrot surrounded by a field of white. You can also add a border. This helps to separate the text from the rest of the image without losing the whole image and the expansive feel of the image. It creates another space.
So Julie, with that last example, you're actually
Yeah.
forcing in a way, you're forcing negative space onto a layout, onto an image,
Exactly.
right? You're basically manufacturing.
Manufacturing space, making our own. And in this case, using the negative space in a photograph for text. This is very common. We may even talk about this in a future webinar, but it works effectively. We don't have to add any shapes. We don't have to add any color. We don't have to add anything. We just use the blank space in a photograph.
Julie, did you crop that image, or was that the whole image to begin with?
I cropped it. I actually cropped a little bit so that my puddle was near the bottom of the page, the slide. I wanted that puddle to feel like it was, you were at ground level and you really saw the splash. And so it was just, that's the only reason why I cropped it.
But by cropping, that's another way to manufacture space, right?
We can, yes, we can crop to take advantage of a blank area in a picture. Any other questions?
No, I mean, all this talk reminds me of, one of the things designers hear a lot, which is make the logo bigger. And one of the old graphic design tricks is, well, first of all, to ask the client to clarify that they want more emphasis given to the logo. And generally that's the case. And very often the solution to that is to make it smaller, right? Mm-hmm. Because by doing that, you increase the negative space, which increases the focus. So it's one of those paradoxes of graphic design that non-designers just sometimes can't wrap their head around, but it works. Once you see it, it works.
Yes, we could use the same exact sized logo and just put a lot more white space around it, and it would give it that breathing room that it needed.
Do you have any suggestions for very very dense content? Because as we see from clients, very often it is a lot more than just a title and a word or
Mm-hmm.
a quote. When you start getting into those 4 or 5 bullet points that have to be there, do you have any solutions there when we're getting into much more text-based slides?
Yeah, I definitely would pay attention to your line spacing and paragraph spacing. Make sure that those that the lines of text are separated so that you can easily tell one line from the next, one paragraph, if you will. Not necessarily that it is a paragraph, but PowerPoint paragraph. Make sure there's enough space. Always make sure you have enough margin from the edge of your slide to any text. I'm saying at least a ½ inch or more if you're talking about inches. Metric, I don't know. Anybody do a quick conversion to?
No, we don't. We're not mess with metric.
So yeah, in this particular slide here, we're talking about there's an inch between the left-hand side of the slide and the letter S. So plenty of breathing room. Your text, as long as you can read it from the back of the room. Now, some folks don't know the exact size of the back of the room, so sometimes I tell folks to squint. And if you can read all of the text on your slide while sitting back and squinting. That's a little bit of a test. Not a completely accurate one, but it helps.
Is there, this might be a tough question, but sometimes people look at those very sparing layouts like Apple or some of the luxury ones you showed, mm-hmm. and say, well, that's a nice design style, but it's a style. So then they ask, if I've seen things out there that are very complex have lots of complex graphics and very dense graphically. Is that not a valid graphic style? They seem to be selling, some big brands use very, complex design styles. So is that a legitimate design style? How does negative space fit into those things?
If we take a look for a second at the asymmetrical composition, mm-hmm. there's quite a bit going on here.
Yeah.
And you could substitute one of these photographs for, say, a filled shape with a couple of lines of text in it. You still have a lot of things going on here, and it's still quite busy, and yet it's still organized. It still has plenty of white space. A widescreen slide has quite a bit of room to play with that negative space. Try not to fill the entire slide with content and use more simple photographs in larger spaces to add a sense of white space. For instance, that fan up at the top right has a lot of black area in it. So if we were to make that larger and maybe use part of that for a little bit of text, we can take advantage of using both the canvas space and maybe some negative space in the photographs.
So if you have more noisy photographs, you might consider not having them be full screen because they would.
I would probably not do a lot of noisy photographs along with a lot of text. I think that starts to look really busy and confusing, and your viewer doesn't know where to look.
Any quick tips? So again, we might handle this in a later episode, but any quick tips for sourcing imagery when you're looking for negative space or good images that can be used under text?
Some of the stock photos providers will give you, allow you to search for copy space. I can't recall which ones offhand, but you can also, there are techniques you can do to blur sections of a photograph and darken sections of a photograph if you're comfortable in Photoshop, for instance. There are some tips you can use with the blur technique in PowerPoint to do a similar treatment. Maybe we will have to talk about the subject at a later.
That's another topic. So we have a thank you, Julie. We have a couple minutes left. Do we have any questions on negative space, white space, empty space? Any other words people have for it? Okay. Any other questions about anything now that we have Julie on? We have another about 30 seconds, I think.
This logo on the screen has a lot of wonderful white space around it, doesn't it?
It does, both within the logo and just in placement on the screen. So sort of both going on. So okay, thank you. Looks like we're gonna end at this point. Remember, our next webinar is going to be number 4. That we're going to take October off. So the next one will be Friday, November 18th at 2 p.m. You'll get emails about that. If you have any ideas or requests for future webinars, you can definitely let the Presentation Guild know and on the web through the website, and we will be sure to cover those. We have an infinite number of topics ahead, and but we definitely want to cover what you guys are interested in. So thank you very much, Julie, and hopefully we will see everybody in October at the Presentation Summit, and then also in November back right here, same bat channel. Thanks, Julie.
Thanks again. Thanks again, Nolan.
And thank you, everyone.